Today is day 4 of the JunJul-87 7-day retreat. Before getting into the talk, which if we get to the topic will be about relationship, let us clarify 2 words that are used frequently. Somebody brought it up in the meeting. These 2 words. It is of great importance, it's essential that the words that are used in a talk are understood to mean the same thing that they're meant to convey, which is not an easy thing, because we may have our own associations and interpretations, meanings for a word, different from the way the word is being used in the talk. And then there can arise misunderstanding or lack of understanding. So it's very good if a word is not doesn't seem to make sense, then to bring it up in a meeting so we can clarify it. The person said, "You talk so much about images, but I don't seem to have exactly an image of myself. A person of action, I see what you're talking about is I play certain roles." And not in this retreat, but some other retreat, somebody said, "I don't seem to have images of myself. I am not a visual person." And in asking, "Well, how do you think of yourself?" the person said, "More in terms of ideas." Even though that person many years later said, "I do have images. I'm just not aware of them." But not to be hung up or misled by the word. The words are very flexible, they're very arbitrary, and we will gladly change or explain them. The word is not the important thing. The important thing is to see how we see or think or feel about ourselves in some kind of symbolic way, rather than the actual experiencing of what is, without any kind of symbolic representation in the brain about ourselves. The brain does that. It has that capacity to make a picture, an idea, or whatever out of what one knows about oneself, has experienced in the past about oneself, has been told about oneself in the past. And this cluster of memories, the brain can think about. Not just that this cluster of memories exists and can be evoked there anytime, but the brain can also think about it. We can think about the story of our life as put together by all the remembered continuous experiences. In whichever way we remember, whether it's pictorially or with ideas or words. Yeah, we do play roles. It's a good expression. Whether or not there's an image connected with it, one has to see for oneself. The other word the person brought up was the word attachment. The person said, you speak about being attached. The example given was to being a victim, attachment to this role of a victim. The person said, to me, the word attachment connotes that there is some conscious awareness of this. But I find, or have found, that often these things take place very unconsciously. I'm not aware of it. So that word attachment doesn't seem to make any sense when there's no conscious awareness. Or consciousness of being victimized, playing that role of a victim. Attachment is by no means, the way the word is used here, by no means necessarily only a conscious process. It is true that most of our attachments we may not be aware of at all. Attachment manifests when we lose something or somebody. One may only at that point be aware how attached one was to that by the pain or the anger, the fear. Remember where we were, some of us at the Zen Center, there was the belief in most of us, maybe all of us, that there was no attachment to the forms, the statues, the rituals, the ceremonies. It was always said that this is emptiness. Meaning one can walk away from all of that. It is just helpful now, but it is empty in essence. But when somebody did leave it, there was great pain, agony, anger, hurt, and the realization of the tremendous attachment that had built up over a few years. So attachment does not just refer to being conscious of a tie, a clinging, clasping, for fear of losing it or not having it. It also manifests when something one is not aware of being attached to is being attacked, is under attack. It's threatened. Then the defensiveness. Whenever we find being defensive about anything or anyone, is there attachment? I don't think we would be defensive about somebody or something we were not attached to. Not defensive with the emotional involvement, the intensity of anger or protectiveness or hurt. So whether or not one is attached to an image or a role one plays, what if that role is threatened? Somebody else may get that job, or the person, as it becomes interested in somebody else. But we know these things happen to us all the time. By our reaction, we may understand better what was taking place before or right now. In the live relationship, from moment to moment, how we react, we can tell whether there is attachment. The repetitiveness with which we find ourselves in a similar situation time after time after time, finding ourselves playing the same role, aspiring to the same image, wanting to be seen in the same way. It's occurring again and again, and surveying that in memory, recognizing it as it occurs again, is that attachment to a certain situation. The word is not so important, but does one see how one lives? What the forces are, the dynamics of it, and the source of it all. About relationship, from the first day in meetings, questions about relationship have come up. Now, there are quite a number of questions that I've written down. I don't know how they all fit together. We'll see whether it all will come together. One person asking, if it is so that we are all wrapped up in selfishness, self-centeredness, can we relate with each other at all? In a deep way? Is it communication? What kind of communication is that if we're all more or less wrapped up in our own little plot? How can we relate to each other? How do we relate to each other? How do we communicate with each other? One person, no, several persons mentioned how in the quiet sitting, suddenly, like a waterfall of images about an old relationship surfaced. All of a sudden, all these images about this long, finished relationship. And not just the images, but tremendous emotions. Throughout the organism, felt throughout the organism. And then immediately wondering, is that relationship not finished? I thought it was finished. It's all, what is that? Can one remain very, very factual and not try to interpret, conclude from what's happening? for some reason, past images surfacing of the person, what one did together, whatever, and the emotions, maybe the anger at something that happened. That's what happened. That's what actually, factually happened. And wondering whether the relationship is still there, is not finished. What does one mean by that? Does one mean, do I still love or do I still hate that person? What is that person at this instant, other than these images? So one sees that images can surface any time. Something triggers them. And these images, faster than thought, one can say, trigger the emotions. That's what happens. And that's what one is related to images and emotions. I don't know who is related to it. It's just what's happening. But was the person ever real? Was one ever related to a real person? Or was it always on the basis of an image, what that person symbolized for one, or stood for, what one wanted of him or her, expected, dreamt about? Or if the relationship broke apart, what one may or may not have projected onto that person. This is, again, comes to the question, how are we related to each other? Are we free of images in our relationships now? Or is this what makes the bulk of our relationship, how we see this person, how we want to be seen in terms of past conditioning, wishes, remembrances, ideals? And also the question, is it possible for the image to surface a remembered picture of somebody long ago and see it just as that, just as what it is, a remembered picture? And see it so thoroughly, so present-mindedly and openly, that all these emotions are not triggered. I'm not saying this is how we should, we should do, but is that possible? Or maybe the first emotions begin to bubble up, to see the whole thing, and the image and see the whole thing. One has been through it so many times. The whole occurrence is a process one has been through. One doesn't have to go through it time after time. If one sees it at a glance, with the energy gathered in present mindedness, not as a defense. I don't mean as a defensive technique. Then that's mind control. As an open, intelligent awareness of how easily we get pulled into a cul-de-sac. And before one is completely pulled into it, to see that and be done with it right on the instant. That's possible. Then one understands the whole substance and nature of images and their interconnectedness with the whole entire physical organism. When it is seen like that, it doesn't need any further interpretation, or does it? Whether this person still means something to one now, or the relationship is not finished or so. I sort of went into this, so maybe this is how we'll do it. We'll go back to the first question and do them one by one. They must all have something in common. We'll see that as we go, maybe. If we're all so wrapped up in ourselves, and how can we relate to each other? How do we relate to someone else if we're wrapped up in ourselves? We're not saying right now we're always completely, forever wrapped up in ourselves. Sometimes we're not. But when we are, which is most of the time, one has to see. When we're wrapped up in ourselves and our problem, our wishes, desires, or misery, anxiety, neediness, how do we relate to another? That relationship is inevitably influenced and determined by the needs and desires and anxiety, isn't it? When we're wrapped up in self, don't we see the other in terms of what we want of him or her? In terms of what this person could be to me, helpful or hostile, affectionate or threatening. How can we see someone if we're wrapped up? wrapped up means? Wrapped up, no windows open. Because it may happen, which it does, that two people have the same neediness, the same goals, the same ambitions, at least at the time of meeting or for a while of being together, and then these common needs, common goals, and common ambitions make for a practical, effective relationship, because one can now try to achieve and attain together, and yet parallel. What holds together is the common cause or the common goal. Maybe the fact that one has children, realizes when this is what one needs to stay together for. But still wrapped up in one's own plot. One can't listen, really openly listen to someone else if one is deeply involved in one's own problems. Can one? Or can one? I don't know. It seems the perception is narrowed or tense, even distorted by these own needs. One hears what one would like to hear, but not beyond that. It's not possible, it's not given. Because the anxiety or fear or needs distort these doors of perception. Maybe it helps if somebody else who is not so wrapped up is listening to one who is wrapped up. Maybe by somebody listening unconditionally, not with immediately a bag full of advice or interpretation or guidance. Just an unconditional, open listening, maybe. One may begin to see some of this wrapped upness. Hear oneself talk. Have some awareness of what is going on in oneself. An awareness that is also unconditional, which is not judgmental, punitive, threatening. It's just awareness, listening, which sheds light. And maybe we're not always totally wrapped up in ourselves. Maybe there are times when there's less of that, more openness. Then how does one relate to another? To observe it. Can we see another person as they are this moment? Or is it inevitable that our past experiences with people, past relationships, dating back to our parents, is it inevitable that this is projected onto the others? And even if that is an inevitable psychological process, can that be seen to take place? Can that be detected, noticed, come upon, that this is what's happening? One is responding like one was responding to someone back in the past. This person has become a symbol one sees for somebody in the past, but that person is not a symbol. Person is what he or she is. What are they? When this process is, when one begins to detect this process of projection, projection either of what one wants of this person due to one's needs, or what one thinks this person is due to what he or she reminds one of. In terms of our own past experiences. Can one begin to see how utterly important and essential it is to be aware of these processes? So that our living together with each other has some depth to it, some life, some love, some directness, other than just the living over of old, stale stories and relationships. The unreality of that. Somebody asked, if one is in a contractual relationship, finds oneself in a contractual relationship already, meaning one has entered upon an agreement to stay together, be married. For whatever reasons, to stay together, not just now, but for the future. And the expectations that are connected with such a contractual relationship. Mutual expectations. Obligations. The question was, in such a relationship, can there be this other energy? Which is not of contract or obligation or need. It's asking, isn't it, whether there can be a freshness in an old relationship. Without needing to go for one's freshness into new relationships, which also become stale after a while usually. Which is ultimately asking, isn't it, whether there can be freshness and renewal in oneself. So the person or the people one is living with are seen afresh. And not in terms of how it's always been or has come to be. The jadedness of memory. The covered overness of the eyes and ears and one's whole being. How can this energy come into being? This energy of newness, of freshness. Without any old method or technique. Without anything. Done to bring it about, artificially as it were. Somebody said, can there be a relationship together without memory? I don't know whether this was a theoretical question, because obviously memory is there. And memory need not jade the eyes and ears, the doors of perception. We'll steal that expression from Aldous Huxley. The only question is, does memory unconsciously, unawares, compel action or distort perception? Unawares, without insight. Or is the listening and looking and acting open, freely drawing on memory when it is needed, or does not divide, or is, when there's awareness that memory is in action, is taking place. One can remember something that arouses the anger, but if one sees it, one is not going on with it. If one sees this as memory, having nothing to do with the present situation, or to invoke some nice reminiscences of what one did together or so, if one is aware what it is that's going on. It is the memory that one carries around, the grudges, the resentments, or the nostalgia for the good old times or for a better future that are in the way of living together openly now. Seeing each other for what one is at this moment. Sharing difficulties now. Not in terms of blame or fault finding, but what's happening? Let's explore it together. One person asked, "What is the relationship here among the sitters?" Of course, one can speculate about this, but the important thing about a question is always how does it apply to oneself? How is one related to the other people here? Other, I don't like that word, but we're using it. Because we are not so other from each other. So much alike. So how is one related to each other here? It's come up several times and comes up in retreats. People expressing a fear of other people. Actually, a situation just like this, a silent week where one doesn't talk with each other, looks at each other minimally, can reveal tremendously how our relationships are with the so-called other people. It really can bring it to the surface and can be looked at. If one takes that opportunity, it's there. What is the fear of other people? Has many facets to it. Maybe one has heard a whole number of rules at the beginning. We don't call them rules, we call them guidelines. These are just things that have evolved over the time that make a smooth retreat possible, but one has background with rules. We all do. Maybe one is afraid of not doing the right thing. Afraid of being watched. Somebody told me this once after a retreat, that for half of the retreat she was afraid she was being watched by the coordinators. That job, incidentally, of being coordinator is usually not one that people volunteer for easily. It's not one of the choice jobs of the retreat. I don't know whether any is. These things just have to be done, and somebody who hasn't done it in a while has to do it if nobody volunteers. Sometimes there are volunteers for it among staff. So is one afraid of doing things wrong, of transgressing, to watch that. This is not anything realistic here. One may not go to the meeting at the right time or do something, but it's so what? It's not a transgression. So is one projecting? Is one afraid of not being as good a sitter? Is one comparing oneself with others? Depth of involvement? The fear of coming out at the short end? We've talked about that before, but can't be looked at frequently enough and clearly enough so it's seen. What comparison does, and to be weary of that habitual activity of the brain to compare. Not to trust it. To see it and to be done with it when one notices it. And wonder whether one can live, at least for short periods of time, without comparing oneself with anybody. Better or worse, in quotation marks. So there can be all kinds of feelings of maybe jealousy of others or envy or the reverse of that. Or maybe none of that. How is one related to someone one doesn't talk with? One person said, actually there seems to be more courtesy and sensitivity and mutual consideration here than usually when people talk with each other. And that is what happens when we're not overlaid with the noise of talking and hearing talk and looking for words and expressing them. Then a different sensitivity can come to life, which amazingly enough doesn't need words at all. One can step out of somebody's way without that other person saying, "Excuse me." And one can open a door for someone, or someone open the door for one, and the action is complete. It doesn't need to be thanked for. Because we're both completely in it. Who is thanking whom? One can see how some of these amenities, when there is real sensitivity and actual consideration, are superfluous. Or very often when they take place, the other isn't there. One has words for something, but the action is not sensitive. So we come back to the very first question. Is one wrapped up in one's own plot? The story of me, the problems, my needs, and so forth. Then the relationship to others is, what is it? Maybe non-existent. Or in terms of projections, needs. But if that wrap comes unwound, which it often does in such a retreat, and there is, at least for times, a relief from this constant self-involvement, self-neediness, self-pity. Anxiety for my future. When that comes unwound, abates, slows down, abates, then one may find to one's surprise that there is a new relationship with everyone, which has nothing to do with projection or demand. It has much more to do with something we call love. The word having been overused, and the word not being that thing anyways. It's something that is not based on anything. It's not conditioned, and it's not a memory. One comes upon it freshly. The words are dualistic. The process is not. It's not I come upon that. It's when the I is not in the foreground or in the middle or in the background, is nowhere. Then that other thing is there. And then there's no fear of people. There's no comparison. It's just, where is the separation? There is none when this brain isn't habitually manufacturing it from past conditioning. When that brain quiets down in that activity, then where is separation other than that there are different bodies sitting here? They're separate, obviously. And everyone and everything is just what he or she or it is. which is nothing, not a thing, nothing to grab a hold of or to reject. We will end here for today.